Hi, and welcome to our second unit of Virginia Studies, Interactions in Action. In this unit, we will first learn about the First Nations of Virginia and get an idea of what life was like for them before the arrival of European settlers. Then, we will find out how the settlers' arrival impacted the First Nations and how they interacted for the next several decades. As we move through the unit, keep your I can statements in mind to guide your thinking. First, let's talk about Virginia's first people. By the end of this section, you should be able to do the following: demonstrate an understanding of the American Indians of Virginia, locate the 3 American Indian language groups on a map of Virginia, describe how American Indians related to the climate and their environment to secure food, clothing, and shelter, and describe how archaeologists have recovered new material evidence at sites including Werowocomoco and Jamestown. Let's start with some important vocabulary. Algonquian is the family of languages spoken by most Indians of the coastal plain, including the Powhatan tribes, the Patawomic, and the Chickahominy. Archaeology is the study of the material items that past peoples have left behind. Artifacts are historical objects such as arrowheads, tools, and pottery made or used by humans. Cherokee is an Indian tribe that was primarily in the Appalachian Plateau and spoke the Iroquoian language. Fossils are the remains or imprint of something that once lived, such as plants or animal bones. Iroquoian is the family of languages spoken in the Appalachian Plateau and in southern Virginia near North Carolina, including the Cherokee tribe. Monacan is an Indian tribe that was a part of the Piedmont region and spoke the Siouan language. A nation is people who share common customs, origins, history, government, or language. Paramount means having great power and influence. Powhatan is an Indian tribe that was primarily in the Tidewater region and spoke the Algonquian language. Siouan is the family of languages spoken by most Indians of the Piedmont, including the Monacan tribe. Now we're ready to roll. What's in a name? Like most educated people of his time, Christopher Columbus knew that the earth was round. He believed that if he sailed west from Spain instead of east, he would reach the Indies quicker. What he didn't know was that North America was between Spain and the Indies. It just hadn't been mapped yet. When he arrived at what he thought was the Indies, he called the native peoples Indians. And long after people discovered that it wasn't the Indies, the name stuck. Now pause the video and take a look at this illustration. What do you notice about Christopher Columbus? What do you notice about the Indians? Why do you think Europeans called the native peoples savages in documents sent back to their home country? Let's dive into the First Nations. Long before people came from Europe, Virginia was home to America's First Nations. For thousands of years, people have fished in the Chesapeake Bay, hunted in the Blue Ridge Mountains, walked the Great Valley, and played along the eastern shore. Artifacts left behind have helped archaeologists develop an understanding of the native people's lives before colonists arrived. Now take a look at this map. What do you notice? Pause the video for a minute to read it. By the time Christopher Columbus made his transatlantic trip in 1492, there were already millions of people living in the Americas. When the first settlers arrived from England in 1607, there were at least 50 Indian nations living in Virginia alone, each speaking a different language. Most people at the time were well-fed and lived in vibrant communities. That is, until the ships began arriving from Europe. Now you might be wondering how we know all of this now. There are no photographs from this time period, and there's nobody around to tell the story. This is where archaeology comes into play. Lynn Ripley began discovering arrowheads, beads, pot shards, and copper beads on her family's farm in Gloucester County, Virginia, years ago. She called a team of archaeologists who revealed she was living atop Werowocomoco. This was the headquarters of the Powhatan chiefdom and was a large Indian town on the banks of the York River. Discoveries such as these are still happening every day. There are currently active dig sites at Jamestown where archaeologists work daily to find anything that will give us a greater understanding of our nation's history. Digging up these old artifacts may seem boring, but it helps archaeologists paint a picture of a time long gone. For example, dried seeds reveal the kinds of crops grown by the Powhatan. A large hand-dug ditch tells us that the town was divided into a spiritual and a living section. Copper pieces and blue glass beads, identical to those that were made in England, prove that they traded with the English upon their arrival. Now let's talk a little more about the First Nations to call Virginia their home. Algonquian is spoken mostly in the Tidewater region by the Powhatan Indians. Siouan is the language of the Monacan Indians in the Piedmont region. And lastly, the Cherokee Indians speak Iroquoian in the Appalachian Plateau. The Powhatan Indians have been living in the coastal plains for the last 15,000 years and thrived long before European arrival. Over time, towns developed close to bodies of water because fishing played an important part in their survival. It was also a vital method of transportation. They made dugout canoes through a process of burning and scraping the inside of a tree trunk. Many Indian homes had vegetable gardens as well. As you move further inland, the Siouan-speaking Monacans lived on the western side of the fall line. Their towns stretched along the Rappahannock and James rivers, as they also fished. The Monacan people had access to copper, which they used to create tools and other important things. Beads made of this metal were a symbol of great wealth, as only those who were high in social standing had them. The name Monacan means earth diggers, which gives us some insight into their customs. Instead of digging graves, the Monacan built raised earth mounds, each mound holding hundreds of people. Finally, the Cherokee peoples lived in wooded areas with tall log stockades to help protect them from attack. Individual towns were about a day's walk from one another. In this culture, women had a lot of power. They were in charge of planting, harvesting, and trading, but also they were responsible for choosing the tribal chief and were considered equal to men on the war council. Years down the road, the Cherokee people would be forced by the colonists to march hundreds of miles west to what is now Oklahoma. This has become known as the Trail of Tears. Virginia's Indians are often called Eastern Woodland Indians because of the importance the woods played in their everyday lives. Fallen logs were used to build homes, boats, and weapons. When it came to shelter, these three Indian groups had their similarities and their differences. For example, the Powhatan people lived in wigwams, which were made of woven mats over frames of bent branches. The Monacan homes were covered with shingles made of bark or bundles of reeds tied together. And lastly, the Cherokee built their homes using either logs or wattle and daub, which mixes mud into the frame of woven branches and dries to be rock hard. As different as they could be, all Virginia Indian groups relied on the same trio known as the Three Sisters for their food. Corn, beans, and squash grew in perfect harmony on the same land. The corn grew straight and tall, beans grew and curled up under the corn stalks, and squash lay in the shade of the corn and beans with leaves that spread and kept the soil moist and prevented weeds from growing. Virginia has 4 distinct seasons, and as a result, Native American groups had to be purposeful in when they hunted, fished, harvested, and planted crops. During the spring months, fish were caught using nets, traps, and spears. Crops were planted, and women picked berries and men hunted wild turkeys. As summer arrived, crops continued to grow, with women tending the fields and children keeping the pests away. By fall, crops were being harvested, women ground corn into flour, and turned dried fruits and meat into jerky for the winter. During the long, cold winter months, women made pots, wove baskets, and tanned deer hides for shoes and clothing. Men hunted birds and trapped small animals. People largely survived on food that had been stored and saved from the previous months.
The Virginia Colony, 1580 to 1620. These are the I can statements for this presentation. I can explain the reasons for English colonization. I can describe the economic and geographic influences on the decision to settle at Jamestown. I can describe the importance of the charters of the Virginia Company of London in establishing the Jamestown settlement. I can identify the importance of the General Assembly as the first representative legislative body in English America. I can identify the impact of the arrival of Africans and English women to the Jamestown settlement. I can describe the hardships faced by settlers at Jamestown and the changes that took place to ensure survival. I can describe the interactions between the English settlers and the native peoples, including the role of the Powhatan in the survival of the settlers. Here are some key words to know throughout the next part of this presentation. Agriculture, growing crops and raising animals for food and trade. Assembly, a group of people gathered together for a common purpose. Borough, a part of a city or county in charge of local matters. It was first used in England as a way to divide land by marking places that had a market and a church. Charter, a document that grants certain rights to a town, city, land, school, or organization. Colony, a place far from home where a group of people called colonists settle. The settlers still keep some attachment to the place they left, and their mother country rules the colony. Legislative, having the power to make laws. Farewell to England. Sitting on her majestic throne, Queen Elizabeth could not relax for 1 minute. England, her island nation, had to find new resources of raw materials: lumber, furs, gold, silver, and other natural resources that could not be found in England. By the late 1500s, a race was on among many European countries to start colonies in the New World, as they called it. Of course, these lands were not new to the Indians who had lived there for thousands of years. Spain, England's biggest rival, had already grabbed vast areas in the Americas and was growing rich with gold and silver plundered from the New World. To make England more powerful, Elizabeth had to claim her chunk too. In the 1580s, she asked her trusted aide, Sir Walter Raleigh, to start a colony for England. The two imagined a colony that, as early as 1585, was called Virginia. The Lost Colony. With hopes high, 110 men, women, and children set sail for the New World. On a hot July day in 1587, the English colonists anchored off Roanoke Island, in what is now North Carolina. When a supply ship returned in 1590, every single settler had vanished. A tree trunk with the word Crow and a gatepost with Croatoan scratched in it were the only clues to their fate. Tales of the lost colony haunted England, and it would be many years before anyone dared to start another settlement. What was the best way to make a colony work? England decided to set up each colony as a business. Imagine a bakery. You need money to buy ingredients to make cakes. You need people to do the baking and selling. To raise money to build a bakery, you can get people to invest or lend you cash so you can start baking. If you sell a lot of cakes, you will make a profit. When the company is a success, you pay each investor a share of the profits. That was how Virginia was started, as a place to get rich. But making a fortune in the colonies was difficult, dangerous, and often deadly. Virginia's charters. The King of England had the power to grant charters allowing people from England to settle in North America. In 1606, King James signed a charter that formed the Virginia Company of London. Its goal was to start a new settlement in North America. The first charter gave the Virginia Company a piece of land that stretched 100 miles inland and 50 miles to the north and south. Jamestown and the James River are named after King James I. In exchange for providing ships, workers, and supplies to build the new colony, each stockholder got a share of any profits. Two additional charters, one in 1609 and another in 1612, greatly increased the boundaries of the Virginia colony. Together, the charters authorized the settlement of the colony, discussed how to govern it, and promised the settlers that they would have all the rights of English people, even though they lived across the Atlantic Ocean. Off to Jamestown. On a brisk December day in 1606, the Virginia Company launched 3 tiny ships, the Susan Constant, Godspeed, and Discovery, with more than 100 men and boys aboard, and set sail across the Atlantic. Who was on board the ships? There were well-to-do gentlemen, soldiers, laborers, and 3 young orphans. On April 26, 1607, they made their first landfall at a place they named Cape Henry. They planted a small cross to honor their Christian faith, then hopped back onto their ships and kept sailing. Finally, on May 13, 1607, the weary voyagers tossed anchor. The next day, they rowed ashore and, with weapons clutched tightly, began to explore some land that seemed like a good place for their new home. A difficult voyage. It had been a long trip, 2 months spent on the stormy Atlantic and 3 more months sailing north from the West Indies. There had been all sorts of turmoil on the crossing, and one passenger, John Smith, had been so much trouble he had been put in chains. Everyone was glad to finally get off the smelly, damp boats and stand once more on solid ground. But they were about to make a big mistake. Christopher Newport. Getting to the new colony was the job of Christopher Newport, captain of the Susan Constant and the leader of the expedition. Once the colonists arrived, Newport kept exploring the Chesapeake. The ocean-going boats were too big, so he used a smaller boat to head up the James River until he reached the fall line, passing dozens of Indian dugouts and towns on the way. The perfect place? The Virginia Company had given strict orders to settle at least 100 miles upriver, but the colonists had seen a peninsula that looked perfect. The water along the shore was deep enough for their ships to dock. It seemed well hidden from attack by Spanish ships, and it was connected to the mainland by a skinny strip of land, making it easier to defend against Indian attacks. There seemed to be a good supply of fresh water. There was fruit for the picking, trees for building houses, waters full of fish, and wild turkeys strutting in the grass. The site was perfect. Or was it? Building a fort. Life in James City got off to a rocky start. There was fighting with the Naturals, the English name for the Indians, who were simply trying to defend themselves. The men quickly went to work building a 3-sided fort on the banks of the river they named the James, in honor of their king. The gentlemen, well-to-do investors who had come to Virginia to grab gold, land, and profits from goods sent back to England, would not pitch in with the work. Was that fair? Hardships. As spring gave way to a hot summer, mosquitoes swarmed and spread diseases. The water supplies grew foul. The food began to rot. Soon colonists began to die, and for the next several months it seemed as if almost every day there was someone new to bury. By September of 1607, almost half the settlers lay dead in the fast-growing cemetery. Perhaps Jamestown had been a poor location after all. Could Virginia be saved? When worlds met. What happened when the English settlers met the Virginia Indians? Over time, the native peoples realized the English settlement would keep growing, and they came to see the settlers as invaders who would take over Indian lands. Still, at first they tried to get along, and they showed the hungry settlers how to plant corn and tobacco. They traded food with the English in exchange for tools, pots, and copper for jewelry. John Smith, taking charge. By the age of 23, Captain John Smith had already seen the world as a soldier of fortune, a man who fights for whomever will pay the most. Smith described himself as brave and fearless. Many others thought he was obnoxious. While aboard Christopher Newport's ship to Virginia, Smith was nearly hanged for stirring up trouble. In December 1607, 7 months after their arrival, Smith found himself in trouble once more. While exploring the James River, he was taken captive by Powhatan's men. Powhatan knew that Smith was a leader of the new settlers and hoped to get the English settlers to join the Powhatan tribes. During Smith's days with the Powhatan, he learned to speak Algonquian and he made new friends. When Smith returned to the fort after his time of captivity with the Powhatans, he found Jamestown close to ruin. By autumn, he began giving orders, telling people exactly what to do. His tough rules helped Jamestown survive, as did trading with the native peoples for food. In 1609, after being badly burned by gunpowder explosion, Smith returned to England. When he next came back to America, he headed to Massachusetts to map that area. He never returned to Virginia. One of John Smith's famous quotes, "He that will not work shall not eat." Powhatan, man of strength. John Smith may have been fearless, but he met his match in Powhatan, the paramount chief of many Virginia Indian tribes. Powhatan knew the English settlers were a terrible threat, but he was a ruler of great spiritual, mental, and physical strength. As he met with Captain John Smith and the English settlers, Powhatan planned to bring them under his rule, just as he had done with the other tribes he controlled. He sent his people to teach the Englishmen survival skills, but over time, Powhatan came to realize that the English settlement would keep growing and would one day take over the native people's lands. Pocahontas, prisoner to bride. We know Powhatan's daughter is Pocahontas, a nickname that means mischievous one. A lively 10-year-old, Pocahontas first met Captain John Smith when he was held in her father's village. She learned English and soon bridged the Indian and English worlds, serving as a contact when the Indians brought food to the starving settlers. When Pocahontas was about 16, she was kidnapped by the colonists in the hope that Powhatan would exchange several English captives. She was taken to a new settlement, Henricus, where she met a tobacco planter, John Rolfe. Rolfe fell in love with her, and the two married in 1614, leading to peace between the Powhatan and the settlers. In 1616, the couple and their child, Thomas, went to England. She met King James I and Queen Anne and saw John Smith again, but she died just as they were about to return to Virginia. Without the help of Powhatan, his daughter Pocahontas, and the Powhatan Indians, Jamestown might have ended up as another lost colony. The starving time. Heat, disease, rotting crops, misery, and death. That was the fate of the first Jamestown settlers. The marshy soil made planting difficult, and the drinking water was contaminated, way too salty. Just a few short months after the colonists arrived in Jamestown, they were in trouble. By autumn of 1607, there was hardly anyone healthy enough to build a home or tend to a garden, and the Virginia Algonquians were certainly not going to become servants for a bunch of foul-smelling settlers. Someone had to do something. Rats and rot. In 1608, Captain Smith took charge of the colony. Smith was tough. Even though many settlers knew nothing about farming, Smith started a no-work, no-food policy. When, in the spring of 1609, the corn supplies were devoured by rats, Smith traded copper and metal kettles for food with the Indians, who also introduced tobacco to the new colonists. Starving time. When that crisis passed, the colonists got down to the work of making their colony profitable, especially by cutting timber. But in their excitement to do well, they failed to stow away enough food for their own needs. When a shipload of new settlers arrived just before winter, things took a deadly turn. That bitter winter came to be known as the starving time. The winter of 1609 to 1610 was brutal. As icy winds blew, the colonists ran out of food. Some ate their horses and dogs. Some even ate their belts and boots. Many of the colonists died. By 1610, the fort was in splinters, its wall torn down. Houses, left empty after their owners' deaths, were chopped up for firewood by the survivors. In June, the remaining colonists decided to give up and head back to England. All hopes of building a new colony were dashed. The starving colonists were making their way downstream toward the Chesapeake Bay when they saw something amazing. There were ships close by, coming from England with 150 settlers and a load of food and supplies aboard. 3 days after it was abandoned, Jamestown was alive once more, saved by the English supply ships. Surviving hard times. Thanks to Captain John Smith's strong leadership, his forced work program with its emphasis on agriculture, growing crops and raising animals for food and trade, and the arrival of the supply ships, Jamestown survived its first years. Still, there was trouble ahead. When Thomas Dale arrived in command of military reinforcements in 1611, he found a place where many colonists spent their days bowling in the streets. That had to stop. Dale could be a cruel man, and anyone who showed the slightest laziness was beaten. Colonists were given a 3-acre plot and told to figure out what to grow or go hungry. A new crop. One colonist, John Rolfe, the man who wed Pocahontas, tried planting a handful of tobacco seeds from the islands of the Caribbean. Soon, Rolfe's sweet tobacco became a favorite back in England and was in great demand. Henricus. Dale sailed farther up the James River and started a new settlement. He called it Henricus, in honor of Prince Henry, the heir to the English throne. It was safer there with fewer mosquitoes and healthier drinking water. With Pocahontas and John Rolfe's marriage in 1614, an uneasy peace settled over Virginia between the Powhatan Indians and the newcomers from Europe. Would it last? The Burgesses. On July 30th, 1619, in the Jamestown church, a group of men sat down to discuss matters of big concern to the Virginia colony. Who were these men, and why were they sitting in a church loft, sweating in the humid summer heat? What do we do now? Through hard times, the Virginia colony had survived. Thanks to tobacco, it was finally making a profit and growing richer. Ships kept arriving with decks packed with new settlers. Some new rules were needed, so the governor of Virginia, sent by the King of England to run things, had called a meeting of his General Assembly. A group of people gathered together for a common purpose. What do we do now? The General Assembly included 2 representatives called Burgesses from each of the divisions of Virginia, and 5 hand-picked men who made up a governor's council along with the governor. Together, they met as one legislative body to make laws for the colony. Only certain free adult men had the right to take part. Why were they called Burgesses? Burg is an old-fashioned word for borough or town. Growing by the hundreds. By the time the House of Burgesses first met, Jamestown had been joined by several new towns along the James River. These settlements were built on the most fertile lands taken by force from the Indians. The colonists called the new town hundreds. In the colonial era, a hundred was a large plot of about 1,000 acres. How much is too much? For 5 hot days, the men talked about how to get along with the Indians. They tried to think of ways to make their neighbors go to church. Most importantly, they tried to set a price for the sale of tobacco to England. But the mosquito-filled air soon led to an outbreak of malaria, and the feverish delegates went home. America's first election. From the beginning, the Burgesses were elected, chosen by men who owned land in their local areas. By the 1640s, the Burgesses were meeting separately from the governor's council. They called themselves the Virginia House of Burgesses. Continuing as the first elected legislative body in any colony in America, they gave free settlers an ever greater hand in making many of the rules that governed everyone in the colony. A birthplace of democracy, for some. The only people who could become members of the House of Burgesses and vote were men who owned land. Virginia Indians, servants, black or white, male or female, and free white women could not vote. As time passed, the rules grew even stricter, so that men had to own at least 50 acres of land to vote. Still, the House of Burgesses would play a huge role in the future of our country. Virginia would become a place where, for some people, democracy and freedom were born. Our current Virginia General Assembly dates back to 1619 with the establishment of the General Assembly and the meeting of its burgesses in Jamestown. It is the longest continuously running elective legislative body in North America. It would become a place where a new cry for freedom would rise in the 1760s, a cry that changed America. New ways, new faces. Jamestown in Virginia became a more diverse colony by 1620. The ships kept coming to Virginia from across the sea in the early 1600s as the Virginia Company kept pouring more money into the little colony in the hope that it would soon become rich. The first Africans. In 1619, a group of about 20 African men and women climbed off a ship near Jamestown. They came against their will, captured by Portuguese sailors and taken by force from their homeland in what is present-day Angola. Doubts remain as to just what their fate was when they arrived in Virginia. The first Africans. They may have become servants for a 7-year period or have been forced into slavery. But there is one thing we can be sure of. Soon, many more Africans would come to America in chains as slaves. It was the beginning of a long and terrible struggle for dignity. Send more people. Why Africans? Virginia needed more workers, but not enough white people were willing to come as servants. Living conditions had improved in England, and word had gotten out that many people were dying soon after arriving in America. Most attempts to enslave the Indians had failed, so the Europeans looked to Africa for workers who would have no choice about coming to Virginia. Many Africans were fine farmers, and they did not die in such awful numbers from old world diseases as the American Indians did. A terrible cycle. At first, slave traders brought people who were already enslaved, mostly prisoners of war. But as the demand grew, innocent people were kidnapped and dragged to slave forts on Africa's coast. Over the next 200 years, millions of Africans were captured, packed onto filthy death ships, and sent in chains to the Americas. Thousands ended up in Virginia, which began to write new laws that led to a lifetime of enslavement for the Africans, a life of misery and little hope. Farmer takes a wife. In 1620, a new group sailed into Jamestown. 2 ships arrived carrying nearly 100 English women. The Virginia Company hoped that if more settlers had wives and children, they would begin to think of Jamestown as a permanent house. The ships brought young women, mostly between the ages of 18 and 24. All of them were poor. Just like the young men who sailed for the new colony, these girls hoped for a better future. Each dreamed of marrying a good man who might own his own farm and who would provide for her as she helped her new husband in the growing colony. Here is a timeline of early Virginia. December 3rd, 1606. 3 ships leave England to start a new colony in Virginia. April 26th, 1607. First landfall at Cape Henry. May 13th, 1607. 104 men came ashore and named their landfall James City. May 26th through June 15th of 1607. After Indians attack, a fort is built to protect the settlers. December 1607. John Smith is captured by the Powhatan. January 1608. Smith, who has befriended Pocahontas, is released. September 1608. Smith elected head of governing council. August 1609. Ships arrived from England with about 300 new settlers, including some women and children. September 1609. Smith injured in a gunpowder explosion, returns to England. 1610, the starving time. 1611, 150 more settlers arrive. A second town, Henricus, is started. John Rolfe starts experimenting with tobacco plants. 1612, Rolfe's Caribbean tobacco crop is a hit in London. Virginia's economic future begins to emerge. 1613, Pocahontas is kidnapped by the colonists. 1614, Rolfe and Pocahontas wed, leading to an 8-year-long peace between Indians and colonists. 1619, General Assembly is founded. First Africans arrive in Jamestown. 1620, 2 ships with English women arrive in Jamestown. Here is a Venn diagram to show the similarities and differences between the Virginia Indians and the English settlers. The Virginia Indians used animal skin for clothing. They grew corn, beans, and squash. They made tools from bone, stone, or wood. They traded food, fur, and leather. They used a bow and arrow. They built homes out of sapling frames covered by reed mats or bark. Their chief was Powhatan, and his daughter was Pocahontas. The English settlers had cotton clothing. They used muskets. They built homes out of wood from trees. They traded copper, metal tools, glass beads, trinkets, guns, and pots and pans. Their tools were made of metal. Their leaders were John Smith, John Rolfe, and Christopher Newport. The Indians and English settlers were alike because they both hunted and fished, grew tobacco, and wanted the land.